So it seems artists are suddenly obsessed with tracing, and for some reason it has become a new trend within the art community on TikTok, and now artists are making videos questioning if their art process can get them cancelled if it is considered the good type of tracing or the bad type of tracing. So let's talk about it for a few minutes.
I really don't know why this is so controversial and needs to be said, but tracing is not cheating. As a matter of fact, the thing about art is that you can't cheat. You can lie for sure, don't do that, but as there are no rules or guidelines or even right and wrong in the making of art, you can't cheat. Tracing is a great skill to have, and I'd recommend beginners to gain some ability at it. It's a big time saver on projects and a great tool for certain desired effects. My one word of caution, however, is that you can cheat yourself. While tracing and transferring is a great tool, the drawings made by it will always have a stiffness and a staleness to them. Don't neglect your practice at drawing and creating by hand. It's here where you develop your own style. Make sure to establish work true to you. And that might include tracing, it might not. Think of it like this. Tracing should be a tool at your disposal, but not something you depend completely on. If a master is only as good as their weapon, are they really a master?
Hey, how's it going, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about tracing. Now I know everyone has their own different opinion on tracing. Some people like tracing and use it as part of their drawing process as an important tool set, while some other artists do not care for tracing and are not even bothered to use it. And some others even consider it cheating to some extent. So first off, what is tracing exactly? Tracing can be referred to as a copy of a drawing or pattern made by drawing over it through a piece of thin transparent paper. While this is mostly referring to the process for traditional artists who trace and draw on paper, there are many other ways artists can trace a drawing. For digital artists, you can literally put any image or drawing underneath the layer you want to draw on and reduce the opacity of the layer, so the layer you are drawing on serves the same purpose as tracing paper. While some traditional painters also use a similar technique, they increase the size of the image or drawing since they have to transfer the printed version onto their canvas before they trace over it to keep the same proportions in their paintings. Now, while all these methods of tracing have all been useful to the artists, some people, however, use tracing as a means for them to steal work from other artists while posing it as their own and pretending they drew the entire drawing from scratch. Some even go to the extent of using these traced drawings to make profit and scam the people who are paying for these commissions. Many artists have been called out severally for tracing over other artists' work by different people on the internet, but it still keeps happening over and over again. While these quote-unquote artists use tracing as the main and or only part of their art theft careers, other artists have varying other reasons for tracing, which mostly fall under these categories. Tracing as a beginner to guide your way into drawing. Using tracing to quickly get ideas across while sketching. Tracing over assets to save time and beat deadlines. Now, judging from the looks of things, each of these reasons all justify why artists trace over drawings in their work, and if further discussed, might give other artists a reason to either start using tracing in their work or have it as part of their toolset when they have to beat a deadline or need to submit a quick commission. So let's briefly take a look at each of these reasons before we talk about the cons of tracing, since clearly it has some disadvantages, which is why everyone is talking about it of recent. As beginners, most artists find themselves copying pictures, drawings, and trying to replicate things they see in an image they like without fully understanding why the artist made the decision they made in the drawing, or understanding things like form, lighting, and how important anatomy is in drawing. As they progress, however, they begin to learn about simple shapes and the importance of shading, which is why most beginners start shading their drawings after making their sketches. Around this early stage of figuring out drawing, they begin to experiment with tracing and trying to get a quick drawing out by going over whatever reference they are drawing from, tracing the outline of the drawing, and then attempting to shade the drawing by eye, judging from what they can see. For beginner artists, tracing serves as a good exercise to get them familiar with drawing and understand how shapes are formed using line art to draw the contours of whatever object or person they are trying to draw. At this early stage, it is okay to trace to get a hang of drawing, but after some time, it will be wise for beginners beginners to invest in learning how to draw proportions by measuring them by eye or by using landmarks in the body or whatever they're drawing, so they don't have to rely on tracing over every single reference each time they have to make a drawing. Next, we have the artists who use tracing to quickly get ideas across while sketching. Now, this is the one I have seen more often than not on TikTok, and it has rather become common to find artists using tracing to get a pose out before they flesh out their character. This use of tracing could be as a result of the artist not properly understanding anatomy, but then they also need to make a quick drawing for their portfolio, and since they cannot learn anatomy in a couple of hours, they simply use a reference photograph of the pose they want to draw as a starting point for their work, then trace over it, clean it up, and proceed to finalize their drawing however they see fit. This technique is also used by some comic book artists and illustrators whenever they have to draw a character in a very weird pose or in an unusual angle where the perspective is literally almost impossible to draw correctly from your head. So then using a reference will make things far much more easier. But since most of the time they have to work in a tight environment, they usually take it a step further by taking photos of themselves in the particular pose they are trying to draw, and then they trace over that, or they trace over a 3D model which serves the same purpose. This saves them much more time and also teaches them how to draw that pose or characters in similar poses off the top of their head. Painters also use a similar technique for portrait paintings when they have to nail the proportions and resemblance in a portrait. So they print out the reference image they're drawing from to whatever size their canvas is and trace over it so the outlines show on their canvas, and all they have to do is focus on getting the colors and values accurate as possible in the painting. This use of tracing saves them a lot of time they would have spent trying to eyeball the distance between the eyes and the measurements from the nose by eye, and makes the process of painting portraits much more faster for them. Some digital painters also do the same, only they just reduce the opacity of the layer and then start looking for the special brush that will render the rest of the painting. Next, we have tracing over assets to save time and beat deadlines. Artists in the animation industry or artists who work professionally on games sometimes have to trace over a model or a drawing when correcting a pose or emphasizing a gesture for the animators to correct, or just for a pass in a storyboard or animatic. Either way, the use of tracing comes in handy one way or another and speeds up the process, especially when they're trying to meet a deadline and get a project to its final form. Now, just before I talk about my experience with tracing and issues I have with tracing and how artists are treating it in the art community, here are some honorable mentions from my video from some weeks back where we talked about tracing a little bit. So be sure to pause the screen to read what each of these beautiful people had to say about tracing. My first problem with tracing is how some artists have solely taken it out of context, relying on it to steal art from other better artists and pose with the trace drawings as if it were their own after just changing a few parts. Some of these people who request to be called artists even base their entire careers off of literally copying or directly tracing over other artists' work and don't even care about the negative feedback they get every time they get called out for tracing on Twitter. They just pretend people calling them out have no idea what they're saying and proceed to post more drawings, paying no attention to the people talking about them in the comments, which sometimes might be a good thing on Twitter since it's mostly a cesspool of toxicity and mindless hate for the most part. But for serious accusations like art theft and tracing, the least you can do as an artist who is being accused by the person who you happen to be tracing over their work is to stop doing that and resort to other methods for making your drawings instead of just doubling down. Everyone's favorite artist from their childhood days, Butch Hartman, also got accused of tracing his commissions, which he sold for $300 or more, which could be quite a ridiculous price tag for a person with his repertoire in the art community. But I guess only the people who truly appreciate Butch Hartman see the value in what others are so blind to see. Now, while a lot of people were curious if Butch Hartman was actually tracing his commissions or not, most of the drawings looked to me like they were heavily referenced and not necessarily traced, since some of the proportions were a bit off, and the majority of the drawings didn't really match up one for one, even though they were in the same pose. So it's safe to assume he probably used the original drawings as his reference, but instead of changing the pose and switching the entire drawing into something new, he just left it as it were. Yeah. Now, me personally, I don't use tracing in my work as of the moment. Have I used or tried tracing before? Definitely. I have used it in different useful scenarios like I mentioned earlier on in the video, but I always found that it made my drawings rather stiff and expressionless, and this is coming from someone who already considers his drawing stiff for the most part. Every time I traced over a pose, it took out the fun and essence of the pose. The final drawing always looked very rigid and fixed, as if the pose wasn't in motion. I think the word I'm looking for is lifeless. The drawings lacked gesture that you will find in drawings that were made freehand. The pose didn't flow through, and anyone with a keen eye for good figure drawing could tell right off the bat that something was wrong with the drawing. Now don't get me wrong, there are artists that could work with tracing and still produce amazing results, but for me, every time I tried it, I just couldn't find a way to convey the same sense of movement and gesture in my drawings like I could do freehand. So I just focused on learning to simplify my anatomy into shapes without having to rely on tracing a pose to create a drawing from scratch. Now of course, there are going to be instances where I may have to trace further down the line, but I guess I'll just figure it out whenever that happens. I think tracing could have a place in every artist's toolset when it comes to drawing and creating images, but artists, and most especially beginner artists, shouldn't neglect the importance of having good foundational knowledge of the fundamentals of art and rely on tracing as the end-all be-all approach to drawing. Take time out to learn anatomy, even if it is simplified, just so you can have a basic understanding of the muscles and how they are shaped, so you can have an idea of what exactly you're drawing or even what you're trying to trace, and find a way to draw using what you have learned from the anatomy and gesture exercises. So hopefully you don't get to draw stiff drawings like me and you eventually begin to rely less and less on tracing as a shortcut for drawing.
This is how I trace my images without moving my screen. First, you're going to go into settings and then accessibility, go on to guided access, and then turn it on. Now you're going to set up a passcode, just choose an easy one. You're going to go to the app that you're going to trace from, triple click the top button, and then draw a rectangle of where you don't want the screen to move. In this case, I chose the entire thing. And then you click start. Now you can trace all you want. To end guided access, just triple click again, type in your passcode, press end, and that's it.
At this point, I believe everyone will probably be wondering how and when you should use tracing in your work, and personally, I'll suggest using reference from 3D models, posing them in whatever pose you want to draw, or taking pictures of yourself in the pose and tracing over that. But even before you try to do that, at least try drawing it freehand and nailing the essence and gesture of the pose, and use tracing if the pose is really difficult or if you're in a time crunch. I wouldn't say tracing is inherently bad, but I believe it could be better if you gradually build a habit of learning to draw the poses correctly before relying on tracing to save you. Unless you're a portrait artist, then my advice will be to do whatever you can to get the resemblance, baby. And as for people stealing art and tracing other people's work on TikTok and Twitter, I hope you realize that instead of actually getting better, you're just indirectly learning the mistakes of another artist and using that to trick yourself into thinking you're actually good at drawing. So whatever insecurities and issues the artist has with their work, it's slowly going to transfer into your own work as well, the more you trace over their work and try to copy it. If you want to trace over another artist's work to learn from them, you can do that in your spare time away from the internet, but posting it online claiming it as yours is only going to get you attention for all the wrong reasons. So focus on yourself, kings and queens. Anyways, that's all I have for you today. Please leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, share it with a friend so they can know when or when not to trace, and subscribe to the channel if you're new here. I'll see all you pretty penguins in the next video. Bye.